Right. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the fourth annual Maryland Legislative Coalition Summit. We are starting our fourth year. For those of you who are not familiar with the Maryland Legislative Coalition, we are a coalition of over 30 some groups, grassroots groups across Maryland. And we've been advocating for legislation, progressive legislation in every session, the three sessions of the Maryland Legislature. Um, we've sorry. We also have I'm Edward Johnson, one of the co-leaders. Jimmy Tarlow is a co-leader, and so is Cecilia Plant. Cecilia Plant has created a climate justice wing to the coalition. The climate justice wing is this year focusing on two major bills. One is the Climate Solutions Act, and the other is the Transit Safety and Investment Act. That coalition is made up of both NGOs and grassroots groups, and it's going to be their major focus this year. Now, you're all probably wondering why we don't have an environmental section on this at this time. The environmental section will be held at the Eastern Shore Environmental Summit, Legislative Summit, that'll take place January 9th and 10th. So we've incorporated the environmental session of this into that summit. And you will find in the link in the chat links to that summit if you want to sign up for it. Also, you will find in the chat a PDF of the one-page presentation that each of the presenters in these panels will have supplied to us, and you're welcome to download it. You'll also find in the chat links to the Maryland Legislative Coalition's webpage and Facebook page. I would like to thank Jimmy Tarlow, who, of course, the former delegate who has been tilting at progressive causes most of his life, Jess Gorski, Aline Alex, John Wells, and Tom Bryson in helping planning the summit. So we are going to begin, and our first speaker shall be Catherine Paul of CASA. You got to unmute her. There we go. Okay, there we go. Somebody's got to.
Thank you so much, Edward. So excited to be here. This session is really unusual. And we're just kind of excited to kick it off and get started, pick up where we left off last session when things got cut short. I also just want to say hello to all the legislators on the call, Senator Waldstreicher, Delegate Ruth, and any others that I've missed. Just want to acknowledge your presence and say hello. I'm going to share my screen, so just give me 1 second. And a lot of our priorities, let's see. Can you guys give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Awesome. Okay. So a lot of our legislative priorities this year are repeated, but I want to start by giving you some background first. So my name is Catherine. I'm a research and policy analyst at CASA. I take care of all of our Maryland advocacy, but we do advocacy on the federal, state, and local level. So just a little background about CASA. We are a membership-based organization. We have over 100,000 members across Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. But most of our work, as many of you guys know, is in Maryland. Our home base is in Prince George's County. Our mission is to create a more just society by building power and improving the quality of life in working class and immigrant communities. And we do that through two different ways. One is direct service and one is advocacy. So when it comes to direct service, we have a ton of different direct services. We do legal representation, legal consultation. We have citizenship services. We have tax services. services. We have ESOL classes. We have worker centers in many of our locations to help immigrants get jobs, and a variety of other services. And then we pair that with advocacy. Like I said, we do advocacy on the state level and local, federal, state, and local level. So really excited. We've been working in Annapolis for a long time, and we really believe that this is one of the #1 ways that we can affect change for our membership. So our vision of a future where we stand in our own power, our families live free of discrimination and fear. Many of you guys think of CASA as a Latino organization. I want to make sure you guys know CASA is an immigrant organization. And over the last several years, we've had our immigrant population in Maryland, but at CASA growing. So we represent immigrants from all over the world, not just Latin America, not just Central and South America, but also all over the Caribbean, West Africa, East Africa. And so it's very important that folks know that our representation kind of widens farther and wider than one might know. CASA originally started off as a Central American Solidarity Association. And actually, we changed our name to just CASA because our membership was growing so broadly. So that's a little background for you guys who are unsure of what CASA stands for. Our advocacy is led for and by our membership. So all of the bills that I'm going to talk to you about today, our members have identified as being their #1 priorities, and that's why we've prioritized them. So I have to kind of start by giving you guys a little background on just kind of the state of where immigrants are right now. Needless to say that it has been a very, 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 very difficult several years for immigrant families who have been under attack by the Trump administration, who have been facing extraordinary hardships at almost every level of government. But I just want to kind of lean into how crazy and difficult things have been for immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants. There are around 275,000 undocumented immigrants in Maryland. How difficult it's been for them during COVID, since the pandemic hit right after legislative session ended. So the undocumented immigrants were left out of the CARES Act. That one stimulus check that came, they were not eligible for, and neither were their families. So this affected all immigrant families, mixed status families as well. They were ineligible for unemployment, ineligible for health insurance, right, during an international health pandemic. And these are things that they're facing despite being on the front lines, despite being our healthcare workers, despite fighting on the front lines back when we had no PPE, right? Back when those tests from Hogan never came, all that kind of stuff. And so I just want to take a moment to just highlight just the extraordinary contributions they've had. On top of all of this, they continue to be targeted and harassed by ICE. And so there's a lot of bills that are going to deal with that this session. Really excited to talk a little bit about it. So what I want to do, we have a lot of priorities this session, and there's so many amazing advocates on the call who are going to talk about all of them. So I'm going to focus in just on the sort of immigrant-focused bills, many of which you've heard about before. One of our #1 priorities is the Trust Act. The Trust Act is essentially like a sanctuary bill, which would make Maryland a sanctuary state. What it would do is it would keep, it would take care of the partnership that ICE has with many of our local and state agencies. And it says, basically what it does is it says Maryland is not going to participate in ICE's racist and xenophobic policies that are targeting immigrants who have not done anything. It also creates some guidance around ICE entry into sensitive locations like schools, courthouses, and hospitals. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the stories that have been popping up of fathers and mothers who were picked up by ICE and deported when they were dropping their kid off at school, as well as the many, many stories over the last several months of immigrants who, during an international health pandemic, did not feel comfortable going in to the hospital when they desperately needed it putting their lives and their livelihoods at risk. So this bill is really, really important. It's been introduced several times, but this year it's going to be introduced by Senator Smith, the chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee. It never got a vote last session, but we're really excited for it to get in. Our House sponsor is Delegate Wanika Fisher, who is absolutely amazing, freedom fighter, also of immigrant descent, who's going to be introducing the bill. The next bill I want to talk to you about is dignity, not detention. You guys might be familiar with this bill at all, so I'm just going to give already, but I'm going to give a quick recap. Dignity of private prisons already are banned in Maryland, but that doesn't include private immigration facilities, right? So private immigration facilities can still come in and create contracts where immigrants are being profited off of for being detained. So there are 3 detention centers in Maryland and that contract with counties, Howard, Worcester, and Frederick. And what those counties do is they rent a certain amount of beds in their jails to ICE to detain immigrants. We want to shut those contracts down, right? Because the county gets money based off of that contract, which incentivizes, right, ICE and our counties to detain undocumented immigrants and detain immigrants. By the way, not all immigrants in detention are undocumented, right? We have permanent residents, we have citizens. It's important for people to know that. It also prevents, it also would make sure that ICE can't come in and make their own individual private detention center. So that's what that bill is going to do. So important for this session. As you guys know, the COVID rates in detention centers have been absolutely insane. The next one I want to mention is the Maryland Driver Privacy Act. Back in 2013, we won driver's license for all, which meant that undocumented immigrants were able to get their driver's license. It's not a normal driver's license, but it's a driver's license that allows folks to get on the road safely. This was done to protect public safety. Legislators did this with the best of intentions. And what happened was a ton of undocumented immigrants started getting their license.
1 minute left.
Thank you. And so what this bill does is it keeps MVA from sharing data with ICE, because that's what ICE is doing. They're dipping into the MVA database and sharing data that way. Finally, I'll mention the Universal Representation Bill. This is a bill that would get legal representation to those who are facing deportation, who are in detention, who don't currently have a right to legal counsel. So we want to make sure they have a right to legal counsel. So I think I have like 30 seconds left. I just want to mention to you guys really briefly that we're supporting many different emergency COVID bills, particularly housing is a #1 issue for our members. Our members are essential workers, so we're supporting these 2 bills here. I can answer any questions later, as well as many of the meaningful police reform bills that are on the table, some other housing justice bills, healthcare for all, and of course, overriding the blueprint. So thank you so much. I know I kind of got through a lot there, but if you have any questions, please let me know. Really excited to getting some victories this session.
Thank you, Kathleen. Next up is Joseph Spielberger of the ACLU.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Joe Spielberger.
There we go.
I'm the Public Policy Counsel for the ACLU of Maryland, together with many, many different organizations that make up the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability. We're focusing on 5 police reform bills this session. So the first bill is repealing the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. The Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights was enacted back in the 1970s in response to a rise in police brutality complaints coming out of the civil rights movement in order to regulate the disciplinary process for officers who are accused of misconduct. Maryland was actually the first state to enact this type of law and remains in the minority of states who have a similar law on the books today. So of course, bills of rights are intended to protect citizens from government actors and not protect government actors from public accountability. So just at a very basic fundamental level, this law, flips that around on its head. And the problem is that it grants officers extra due process rights that go above and beyond what the Constitution requires that don't apply to any other government employee, which makes it harder for police chiefs to discipline their own officers, regardless of how compelling the evidence is and how egregious the behavior is. So for instance, officers can only be investigated by other sworn law enforcement officers, and complaints have to go through kind of a mini hearing board process before an officer can actually get disciplined. It's important to know that the only thing that the Constitution requires as far as due process is concerned is an opportunity for an employee to be heard and give their side of the story to the decision maker. And then after the decision is handed down, they have some right to appeal an adverse decision after the fact. There's no constitutional requirement to have this kind of mini hearing board process before that. And it's precisely because of the extraordinary power that police have over the people they're serving, of course, the power literally of life and death, the power to deprive people of their liberty, and also the most disproportionate impact on people of color, that we cannot continue to shield law enforcement officers from discipline. So this bill would repeal the law, but then also set out a default process for police discipline that's based around the State Personnel and Pensions article, which would clarify that officers have the same due process rights as any other state or local public employee. It would grant the chief the power to discipline officers without the hearing board decision, and officers who choose to do so could then appeal that decision to the circuit court. But additionally, we want to make sure that, after the law is repealed, that a lot of the really problematic provisions don't just end up popping up at the local jurisdiction level. So we also want to preempt local jurisdictions from establishing kind of mini versions of LEOBR. Our bill will prohibit local jurisdictions from entering into collective bargaining agreements that have language that conflicts with the default process that this bill will set out. And will also allow for investigations to be done by people other than sworn law enforcement officers. So that means that local jurisdictions who choose to do so can start having the conversation around establishing independent civilian review boards with the power to make disciplinary decisions. So that's the first bill. The second bill is establishing a statewide use of force policy to regulate how police officers can use force. So right now, Maryland is one of only 9 states that does not have a statutory limit on the use of force, which means that the use of force is regulated by Supreme Court case law that authorize force when it's objectively reasonable, which is a really low bar, and history certainly shows us does
more. I go to chat, meeting settings, and go to there.
Does
also,
not go
you could have a virtual background. Turn the camera.
No.
See?
You don't turn the camera on.
Mute your line.
to protect Maryland residents. Sorry, I think there's some.
Muted.
Okay, I think I'm back. Sorry about that. So this bill would do a few particular things of importance. First, it would elevate the legal standard to say that officers can only use force when it's necessary as a last resort and only after exhausting de-escalation tactics. Second, we're specifying an expanded definition of lethal force, which includes things like chokeholds, strikes to the head or neck, multiple discharges of a taser, and other specific acts. The bill would require looking at the totality of the circumstances in order to determine whether force was justified in a situation. So that means looking at things like the officer's behavior leading up to the time that force was used and seeing whether the officer attempted to de-escalate the situation or whether the officer's behavior actually contributed to the need to use force. The bill would ensure a civil right of action for people who have been victimized by unlawful or excessive force, and then also require additional training, data collection, and reporting requirements. So that's bill number 2. The third bill is reforming the Public Information Act to allow disclosure of all complaints of police misconduct. So of course, as you know, the PIA governs how members of the public can access public documents from government agencies. And the problem is that right now, the PIA classifies officer misconduct files as personnel records, and personnel records are always confidential. So this means that when you file a complaint of police misconduct, all that you can see is the outcome of the complaint and any discipline, if any, that the officer received. You can't see whether, an agency interviewed certain witnesses, if they looked at different pieces of evidence. And in short, there's no way of knowing just how seriously they took your complaint. So the current proposals would only allow the disclosure of sustained complaints and a very, very narrow subset of unsustained complaints. We already know from prior PIA requests that only a very small percentage of complaints are sustained in the first place. But more importantly, in addition to police killings and a lot of the higher profile incidents, it's really the more common lower level incidents that can be just as corrosive to police community relations. And so that's why it's so important to allow agencies to disclose all police complaints, because that's really the only way of knowing that they're actually taking these investigations seriously. The fourth bill would remove police officers from schools. So right now, every Maryland school district has officers in schools, despite a lot of evidence that shows that police presence only criminalizes students for minor age-appropriate behavior and is one of the key architects of the school to prison pipeline. And without really addressing any serious safety threats. And this is particularly true for Black students, other students of color, and students with disabilities who are all disciplined, suspended, and arrested at disproportionate rates. This bill would not prevent schools from having security guards, calling police during an emergency, or establishing other safety protocols, but it would prohibit school districts from employing or contracting to put police officers in schools and then redirect funding toward hiring school counselors, social workers, psychologists, and providing better mental health services, behavioral services, wraparound services, and restorative practices. And then the fifth and final main bill is returning control of the Baltimore Police Department to Baltimore City residents. So of course, Baltimore is one of only a couple of majority Black jurisdictions in the state of Maryland, and it's the only jurisdiction in the state without control over its own police department. That's because the Baltimore Police Department is actually a state agency. So there's really very little that Baltimore city government can actually do to reform its own department, which has serious implications for race equity, effectiveness, and accountability. So Baltimore City can hire and fire a police commissioner and make some suggested budget modifications, but it cannot enact department-wide policies, provide local oversight over the implementation of the consent decree, and work to actively create more police accountability and more public trust of police. So Baltimore residents who want to lobby for change have to travel to Annapolis. They have to lobby legislators who aren't necessarily from Baltimore, don't represent Baltimore, and are therefore less accountable to the people of Baltimore. So this bill will help us to better hold local leaders accountable, allow city residents to have a louder voice to advocate for change, and really help ensure that the decisions concerning the police department are really being made in the best interests of Baltimore City. Additionally, we're certainly continuing to support a lot of our other partners' efforts in many different areas, including immigrants' rights and the Trust Act, criminal legal reform, gender equity, and other civil rights and civil liberties issues that affect Marylanders across the state. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And speaking of questions, I forgot to bring up that part. If you have any questions for our speakers, put ask and the name of the speaker you want to ask the question of in the chat. We will have a half hour for questions at the end of the speakers. We have a question monitor who is going through the questions and will pick out which questions to ask our speakers. Today is Jess, is our question moderator. Next up is Dr. Crystal Francis.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Maryland Legislative Coalition, for all the important work you're doing and hello to everyone that is involved in supporting the work. I'm Dr. Crystal Francis. I am also going to be here speaking with Phil Karoom, we are both on the board of the Maryland Alliance for Justice Reform. We are basically a bipartisan, all-volunteer statewide alliance that seeks legislative changes to support Maryland's correctional policies. And our work is conducted in three thrusts. First, we support policies we call it at the front door. So that's to prevent individuals' negative encounter with the criminal justice system. Second, we do our work behind the walls. That is to support policies and processes to make sure that our correctional facilities are operating, providing the necessary rehabilitative services to support inmates and to also ensure that the conditions behind the walls are humane. And then lastly, we do our work for reentry, which we call the back door. So ensuring that returning citizens have access to all of the supports that they need to be successful. Today, speaking on our policies regarding the front door and behind the walls will be Phil Karoom, and then I will talk about what we're doing for reentry. So I'll turn it to Phil.
Thank you. So I would like to say, again, thank you to the Maryland Legislative Coalition for inviting us. On the front door, again, the goal is to reduce the occasions for folks to be incarcerated because there are so many negative consequences that go with that. In that regard, we support some measures that have already been talked about, such as the police reform. Another measure that is going to be talked about if it's introduced, marijuana legalization, and an important issue, felony murder, which is a way of drastically increasing the possible incarceration of individuals who may not themselves have committed a murder, may not have known that it was going to happen. Again, the goal being to shrink our prisons and to use the funds that we would save by smaller prisons for other more valuable purposes, such as drug treatment, job training, and things that would actually make the public more safe. One other front door initiative we'd like to mention that has passed the House multiple times and was getting stuck in the Senate before COVID is a bill to permit citations when there are misdemeanors, less serious offenses. There's no reason that a person who is known in the community needs to be waiting in jail for the trial date to come. If they were issued a citation like a traffic ticket, as is done in many other states, then that could save unneeded time in jail before a trial date, also reducing the person's exposure to COVID-19, which is a big problem in our jails and prisons, and would save the states and the county money. Behind the walls is our second major area. And the thing that the major would like our legislature to recognize is that our prisons have not been working well for a long time. Our recidivism rate is way too high. And there are other programs that we could adopt that would make them work better. There is a model prison program that has been adopted in, for example, Connecticut, Georgia, other places, which can reduce the recidivism rate by focusing more resources on higher risk individuals. And that can also basically change the culture of the prison to work on the character and reduce the impetus for a youthful offender to commit other offenses. We'd like to make this available to those who even have crime of violence convictions. In our recent statutes, there's been an exclusion to say only nonviolent offenders could receive special services, and the result has been that 85% of the folks in our prisons who have violent convictions are not available to get these, or do not have these resources available to them. We also have a proposal for something called an ombuds office, where complaints could be analyzed and could be mediated. So rather than the current system, which has a bureaucracy in various levels that will ultimately suppress the complaint, a ombuds office would try to mediate the easy ones, and the ones which are difficult and persistent would analyze to make policy recommendations that could be published at least once a year. I would like to go on, but I know our time is short, so let me return it to Dr. Francis to comment about the backdoor and reentry.
Yes, thank you so much, Phil. So regarding the back door, for those of you who do not know, we are focusing on prisoner reentry. So we drafted a bill for the state to establish a statewide reentry council, which would bring all stakeholders together from state prison, local jails, nonprofit, community-based service providers, individuals who have the lived experience, so that we can collaborate, improve information sharing, and strategize to improve access to the resources and supports that individuals who are returning home need to be successful. We do understand that with this new legislative session, there are going to be, some parts of the Maryland General Assembly will have caps on the number of bills. So since we do have the support of Secretary Rob Green to implement this, we are not going to necessarily put forth a bill yet, but we do want to make sure that we keep tabs to ensure that the Department of Corrections does actually go forward and implement this. Right now, we know that a letter went to the governor just to make him aware that, Department of Corrections would be moving forward with establishing the statewide reentry council. And then the second phase would be inviting practitioners and individuals to become part of the council. So we're asking people to closely monitor that, because we want to ensure that this statewide reentry council is implemented. There are local jurisdictions like in PG County, also Baltimore County is revealing their local reentry council. So we want to ensure that we have something on the state level where we can all plan and strategize to address the challenges pertaining to reentry together. We're also supporting the women's pre-release. So we're hoping that this legislative session, we're able to override the governor's veto to restore the women's pre-release in Baltimore City. So that was a initiative that was put forth from Out for Justice, Maryland Justice Project, and Maryland Prisoners' Rights Coalition. And we're also looking to support Job Opportunities Task Force Expungement Initiative, which was the REDEEM Act that was going to help repeal the unit rule. So we're closely monitoring, work on those, and we're going to ask that you all who are passionate about reentry support these initiatives. Phil, any closing remarks?
We would just say that a web page, the link just went into the chat, is there if folks want to see more information on these initiatives. I'd like to thank our sponsors. I see Senator Waldstreicher is with us this morning, and I'm not sure who all else because I only have one page in front of me. But we look forward to working with other advocacy groups and with trying our new muster software, which in 2 clicks will help folks send letters or make phone calls to legislators. And again, thanks very much for having us this morning.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Catherine Francis and Phil Karoum. A reminder also that we have our afternoon session at 2 o'clock. If you want to attend, you need to re-sign in again to get the Zoom, because the Zoom numbers sign-ins will be different than this morning's session. Next up, we have Jeremy Lemaster from Pre-State Justice. Unmute him.
All right, great, thank you, I got it. Morning, everyone.
Okay.
My name is Jeremy Lemaster. I am the Executive Director for Free State Justice, and my pronouns are he and they. Give me 1 second as I start my presentation. I always have this moment of panic where I forget how to start a presentation. So Free State Justice is Maryland's LGBTQI plus advocates. We are a statewide organization, and we trace our origins back to the late 1980s. Over the years, we've presented in a number of different iterations, most recently as Equality Maryland and the Free State Justice Legal Project. So today we continue that mission of supporting LGBTQ folks across the state, really with the vision to ensure that folks are able to live authentically with safety and dignity in all their communities. To that effect, in our mission, we have chosen to center the lives of low-income LGBTQ folks in both our services and our policy advocacy. Part of the belief there is that a lot of LGBTQ policy to date has really centered folks that might not have the experiences of those that are marginalized or on the outsides. And really moving forward, we want to ensure that those are centered in our work. To that effect, we identify a number of communities within the LGBTQ community to really target and center. Like I said already, people with low or limited incomes, transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks, people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people of color, our youth, our elders, and those that are in geographically underserved communities across the state. In terms about how we go about doing our work, we at our core are a direct legal services provider, both through our in-house staff attorneys as well as our very robust pro bono attorney network. From there, we also take on impact litigation casework to really ensure that laws that we do have on the books as it relates to LGBTQ rights are enforced. And we draw upon both our legal services and impact litigation to inform our legislative policy advocacy and community organizing agenda. After we've done this work in sort of advancing or creating new rights and resources for LGBTQ folks, we engage in outreach, training, education, both for our community, insofar that we do know your rights and legal clinics for our community members, as well as advocacy and sort of preparing them to be their own advocates in their spaces. But we also reach out to our allies across the state through state agencies, partner organizations, for-profit firms, to really ensure that they are following the law and they are building safe and inclusive spaces for LGBTQ folks wherever they may be. We also then sort of envision our work as being a leadership development and capacity building incubator for LGBTQ folks and community members. I've been very excited to see over the past 3 to 5 years, very robust local LGBTQ orgs pop up across the state in different spaces to really advance not just pride, but policy advocacy work, and really looking forward to ensuring that folks in different regions throughout the state have resources. And so through this mission that we are able to sort of secure justice for our community. In terms of the big picture, this is just a snapshot of our work last year. We had over 400 requests for assistance, and from that, we were able to open 199 cases and we closed another 201. We have a current panel network of about 250 attorneys, and we had 9 impact litigation cases that we had in a few different areas of family law, criminal justice, as well as access to public accommodations that we feel really had significant or wider impact for our community. So in terms of our current case practice priorities, I'm just going to quickly run through these. We typically work on family law. Marriage equality has not been on the books all that long, and so we still have continuing issues around supporting same-sex couples as well as trans and non-binary folks in their marital relationships, sort of ensuring they have access to rights. We routinely continue to experience healthcare discrimination, especially for trans and non-binary folks. Around education and youth, there's still a number of issues where LGBTQ youth are not supported. Additionally, LGBTQ folks are more likely to experience poverty, homelessness, substance use, and incarceration, especially Black and Indigenous and Latin LGBTQ folks. So to that effect, we do focus a lot on police interactions, corrections, criminal justice. We continue to also support, easing the burden of name and gender change processes for trans and non-binary folks, and we continue to enforce anti-discrimination laws. I wanted to also just kind of briefly highlight some of our developing case practice areas. Again, wholesale decriminalization in response to the fact that LGBTQ folks are more likely to be incarcerated. Again, really working to ensure that the crisis of LGBTQ homelessness is addressed. And then also providing resources and rights for those of our community who are engaging in sex work. We also are looking to shore up our protections for LGBTQIA+ immigrants, especially those that are seeking asylum on the basis of sexual or gender identity. So in terms of our legislative agenda, the first two I really want to focus are the first group I want to focus is really around support for trans and non-binary folks across the state. First, we are looking to modernize birth and marriage certificates. Maryland enacted an X gender marker just last year. In addition to that, folks are looking to update and change their documentation, both for birth and marriage certificates, and have encountered significant issues in having gender marker or name changes done on these certificates. In fact, one of our clients was directed by the Division of Vital Records to first divorce and then remarry in order to have their name and or gender updated on their marriage certificate. So we're looking to really simplify or streamline that process. Additionally, as you all may know, trans and non-binary folks are disproportionately vulnerable to violence, not just in this state, but across the country. To that effect, we are trying to follow suit with a number of other states that have enacted bias, rage, or panic defense bans. In the state of Maryland, we sort of modeled this piece of legislation off of existing bans on sort of spousal rage and as a criminal defense. And we are really looking to make sure that this is completed this session. This is a holdover from a COVID interrupted piece from last session. And the last is around a publication waiver for name changes. So in the state of Maryland, when you change your name, there is a requirement that it has to be published in some periodical of a certain circulation. And we have encountered a number of issues in serving our clients over our tenure. Just in engaging in this process, and there's huge disparities county by county when it comes to conducting a publication of your name change. The main issue here is that for trans folks, especially our youth, some newspapers do publish these items online, and then this is becomes part of a sort of permanent online, easily accessible record that can more or less out trans folks and really sort of increase their vulnerability to being outed in other spaces. There is a mechanism for which you can request a waiver of the publication requirement, but in our casework, we consistently see differing approaches to granting these waiver requests. So this piece of legislation, this passed unanimously in the House last session before COVID interrupted it. But this would just require that if a waiver of the requirement is requested, a judge has to grant it. And that would ensure that all counties in the state are granting these requests and not just some counties. We don't want some folks in the state to have a better sort of experience in the name change process than others. The next really set of priorities are around our youth. Really our new big piece that we've drafted and submitted this year is the Youth and Families Protection Act. And so this would advance non-discrimination language for child welfare services and juvenile justice services. So for those of you that don't know, Maryland does have statewide non-discrimination language, but that is only for public accommodations. And so there's a lot of gaps that we are looking to plug throughout the state's myriad of services and offerings. The idea here is that if taxpayer funds are being utilized to advance child welfare services, those services need to be non-discriminatory in nature. Additionally, they need to ensure that we are providing training, cultural competency building for folks, and that there is some mechanism for when folks do experience challenges in accessing services, they're able to submit complaints and have them heard. Similarly, in partnership with ACLU Maryland, we have the Inclusive Schools Act, which does similar work in ensuring that there is non-discrimination language in our public education for K through 12, as well as for any educational institutions that are receiving taxpayer money. Again, if there is taxpayer funds being allocated to these services, they need to be non-discriminatory in nature, and there needs to be a mechanism set up for folks to be able to submit complaints and have those complaints heard. Again, we're also supporting the veto override for the Maryland's blueprint, and we also are supporting a commission on history, culture, and civics education that would really provide recommendations to the Department of Education on enhancing underrepresented minorities, including LGBTQI folks in our education in the state. The next set, we have two other kind of pieces we are monitoring. One is around a senior bill of rights, and that is advancing non-discrimination in aging services. However, we have some concerns around this piece of legislation, and we are really looking to work with the Department of Aging to ensure that LGBTQ+ elders, especially in the midst of a global pandemic, are being outreached to, are being targeted, are being provided services, and that we are really protecting our elders and those that are aging. We also have a bill for Maryland State Commission, which would establish a body to help review agencies and provide recommendations for enhancing their support for the community. So while I have you all on the phone, I also want to talk about some other priorities that aren't necessarily going to be pieces of legislation this session, but something we are going to begin talking about. Again, we have ongoing issues with conditions of confinement for LGBTQI folks, of folks that are incarcerated, not being detained in safe or supported facilities, or are being subjected to solitary confinement. And we are looking to address these issues more systemically. In support with the People's Commission to Decriminalize Maryland, LGBTQ folks are often pipelined into incarceration through failure to obey a lawful order, solicitation, and or panhandling. In sort of a cursory review, a number of municipalities have anti-panhandling legislation, which is unconstitutional. And so we'll be looking to address these issues because we see these as critical to pathways for LGBTQ incarceration. In terms of human trafficking and sex work, we want to make sure that safe harbor resources and funding is expanded to trans and non-binary folks that are engaging in survival sex work, especially for our emerging adults, those that are age 18 to 24. We have currently identified a number of gaps in resources and services for those folks. And additionally, we did ban conversion therapy in the state. However, these are being attacked routinely, and a number of our clients are being taken out of state or out of the country for conversion therapy. And we currently have no recourse to provide support or service to those folks. And so that is an issue I wanted to make sure to lift up in this space.
Thank you, Jeremy. Next up, we have Michael Cohen of the Maryland Legislative Agenda for Women.
Hi, everybody. Just to give you a brief overview for those of you who may not be familiar with MLAW, we're a statewide nonpartisan coalition of individuals and organizations that advocates for issues that make Maryland a better state for women and families. We've been a collective voice for advocacy for more than 26 years, and we have made our collective voice heard on the successful passage of 97 pieces of legislation. Every year we produce and distribute a legislative agenda document to all legislators and advocates throughout the state. And we've supported legislation to address domestic violence, sexual assault, economic justice, human rights, healthcare, family law, and criminal justice. MLAW is also an ally in the fight against systemic racism, racial injustice, and discrimination. And we support diversity and equity by strongly advocating for legislative priorities that address issues of concern to women that also disproportionately affect communities of color. Bills are presented at an annual fall conference by lead advocacy groups and legislators, and paid MLAW members then vote to select the priority bills that are included in the agenda. We ask individuals and organizations, that could be all of you, to sign on to the agenda to affirm your support and demonstrate our collective power. Following the November 2020 virtual fall conference, we sent the ballot to MLAW members who ranked their choices, and the voting will be completed in late December. The results will be reviewed, and the proposals that will be on the agenda document will be finalized by the Board of Directors in early January. During the session, we introduce and disseminate the agenda document. We collaborate with lead groups and legislators. We write letters of support. We provide testimony and provide information, updates, and legislative alerts via email, our website, and Facebook page. After the session, we communicate legislative outcomes with a final report and a legislative wrap-up. We invite all of you to get involved and support MLAW and to support the critical legislation that makes a difference for all women and families in Maryland, and to make your voices heard. I'm now going to give you a little preview of the 2021 bills that were proposed at our conference. And please note, these are not necessarily the bills that will be on the final agenda because, as I said, the voting has not been completed, but it will give you an idea of the bills that were presented. So let me hope this works. So, now it's not working. Okay, that's not good. Okay, this is not good. All right, let me just, sorry about that. Let me just go back and here we go. Can you all see that?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry for the confusion. I thought I was going to be able to pull it up right away.
I don't see the whole page.
No, I'm going to scroll down. So the first thing is a bill that was presented on last year's agenda, and it was vetoed by the governor, and it concerns background checks for all gun sales in Maryland, and we are supporting an override of that. That would close the loophole in Maryland law to require background check on all gun sales, and especially unlicensed sellers online and at gun shows. And we're particularly concerned about this bill because it would keep rifles and shotguns out of the hands of people with dangerous histories, including domestic abusers, convicted felons, and subjects of red flag laws. So I'm just gonna, okay. So there were 4 categories that we had presentations on: safety and justice, healthcare, economic justice, and social justice. So the first group was safety and justice. And there were a number of child abuse and sexual assault bills in that section that were presented. The first is one on codifying child abuse and domestic violence cases, making sure that where there is child abuse or domestic violence, that is considered in the case of child custody. And the next one was, whoops, sorry. I'm not good at this and I apologize. Adding a continuing course of physical child abuse to the statute for first-degree child abuse. So that's a continuing course, not just one incident. The next one would be requiring conviction and sentencing for certain sexual abuse crimes involving a child over the age of 12 to include lifetime sexual offender supervision. The next one would repeal allowing marriage as a defense to sex crimes. Currently that marital rape law is limited to certain circumstances. And the final one in that section is to make police sexual misconduct a misdemeanor, prohibiting law enforcement officers from engaging in sexual acts with a victim, witness, or suspect during an investigation. The next section is healthcare. And there are a number that were presented in this category. The first affects pregnant incarcerated women and providing a community care for them, a continuity of care for them for healthcare, substance abuse, and mental health through a coordinated re-entry plan. The next several concern students. Whoops. Sorry about that. Okay. One would include the provision of menstrual hygiene products in all public, elementary, middle, and high schools. And it would require the installation of menstrual hygiene products, product dispensers in restrooms over the next 5-year period. The next one is for pregnant, expectant, and parenting students, and it would require public school personnel to assist them in securing transportation, childcare, and lactation supports to encourage their continued enrollment, increase in school attendance, and improve educational outcomes. And of course, we know that students who have children while they're in high school often drop out, and that affects their economic well-being for years to come. The next one would create a study to look at the challenges for pregnant and parenting students by collecting data on their educational outcomes and barriers to success. And the final one in that section is a Health Equity Resource Communities Act that would help to enable locations with poor health outcomes to compete for grants, tax incentives, and healthcare provider loan repayment assistance. And that would be funded by 1 penny per dollar increase in the state alcohol beverage sales tax. There are 3 proposals that were included, in the economic justice section. The Time to Care Act, which would establish a family and medical leave insurance program, was on our agenda for last year, and it's going to be proposed again. It would establish a family and medical leave insurance fund to provide partial wage replacement for employees to care for a new child, a family member's serious health condition, their own health condition, or a family member's military deployment. And obviously, when we look at the impact of COVID-19, we see how critical that could be. The next one is obviously related to what's happening currently. The Maryland Essential Worker Protections Act would provide essential workers with protections in the workplace to ensure health and safety during pandemics. Almost done here. And the Self-Direction Act, which would allow caregiving family members of individuals with developmental disabilities to be reimbursed for their time in care. And the final one that was presented this past fall was to improve access to voting, looking at the improvements that were made this year and making sure that they continue by expanding early voting days, hours for polling places, easier vote by mail, and broad access to voting centers. So, you know, I'm sure that that is much broader than just women, but it certainly would, you know, assist women and women of color in particular to engage in the voting process. So those are all of the ones that were proposed. I don't know which ones will be selected. They're, again, as I said, they're currently being voted on, but that gives you an idea of the kinds of issues that were presented. And I expect that during the next day and a half, you will hear more about some of these issues from the organizations that presented them.
Thank you, Michael Cohen. Next up, we have Luke Jones from Normal.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having Maryland Normal as part of the Maryland Legislative Coalition conversation. This is really valuable service to citizens. The point obviously being providing access for citizens who want to get involved and have an impact and a voice in the legislative process. My name is Luke Jones, and I'm the executive director for the state chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Most of you have heard of Normal before because we've been working for changes in marijuana laws at the federal and state level for more than 40 years, including here in Maryland. Long before the current medical program got up and running, we've been working across the state of Maryland to bring attention to this issue. So I want to make sure that I start by thanking the Maryland Legislative Coalition, because typically consumers of drugs, you know, have not been comfortable in including within the progressive advocacy community because of all of the stigmas associated with those who consume illegal drugs. And when Normal as an organization began this conversation around how we respond to the presence of marijuana consumption within our society, we only had about 12% of public opinion favorable towards removing criminal penalties. Obviously, the landscape has completely shifted, but the arguments and the rationales and the justifications for removing criminal penalties associated with marijuana have not changed. And the thing that people quickly come to recognize in this conversation is that it has very little to do with marijuana. It has very little to do with marijuana. It has to do fundamentally with what is the proper application of the police powers within our society. So let me jump right in, because I'm going to be very concise. I'm not going to take a lot of time. What I'm going to be most interested in is whether or not we have any targeted questions. The reason why Maryland Normal is part of this panel is the focus on criminal justice policy reform and policing reform. We do not advocate consumption of or advocate risky behavior. What we advocate for is a rational set of public policies for how we tolerate risks that people choose to take. And we need to balance questions of harm that is done and perpetrated by state policy, with the costs and benefits across a range of public policy options. So let me just introduce you guys to the fact that Maryland Normal has no paid staff. We are not at the state level professional lobbyists or anything like that. I am a federal government employee. I'm a citizen of Silver Spring, Maryland. I live in Montgomery County in State District 20. I'm represented in the General Assembly by Will Smith in the Senate, who is the current chair of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. And in the House of Delegates, I'm represented by 3 outstanding members of the General Assembly, Janelle Wilkins, Lorig Charkoudian, and Delegate David Moon, all 3 of whom are taking leadership roles in the General Assembly on a number of issues of interest to coalition member organizations. So the reason I start introducing myself in that way is one of the missions for our organization is to make sure that every single Maryland voter can do the same thing that I just did. Know who represents you in Annapolis and know what their positions are on the issues that are important to you. I did not come into political activism out of an interest to change marijuana laws. I came into political activism because I'm curious to know whether or not we are able as a people, as a society, to solve the problems that we face as collectively. So one of the most under-recognized in public discourse violations of civil rights pertains to marijuana consumers. There's no other segment of the society, none, that is more abused by the disproportionate and racist allocation of police authority than marijuana consumers. A lot of people don't realize that. In the state of Maryland, 60%, just shy of 60%, about 57% of all drug-related arrests in the state of Maryland are marijuana-related arrests, 60%. Okay, so there really is no conversation about policing reform or criminal justice policy reform without talking about how we deal with marijuana. On the list of public policy options involving police officers in the production, processing, and distribution and sale of the marijuana product is literally the worst public policy option available to us, literally. And it, in fact, is the most harmful. And it's a policy that was birthed for racist purposes. It was created for public policy purposes, okay? And not constitutional arguments or these other reasons. It was created for racist purposes. And it was a public policy choice to take this plant and put it into the criminal justice system to begin with. And it's a political decision to take it out. It's a political decision to take it out. So we welcome a broader group of advocacy organizations to put this at the top of the list because it should have been handled a long time ago. So what I'm going to do real quickly is to just share a couple of things with folks, if that's okay with everybody. We have a sea change in national policy, obviously, with the MORE Act. And can I hear that the audience can see a slide regarding the Maryland delegation MORE Act votes? Can someone come off mute and let me know you can see the slide?
You can see the slide.
Thank you, Ed. So just recently, you've all heard that the US Congress passed the MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act at the federal level. Now, the reason I bring this up is the provisions of this act are going to look very familiar to folks when they see the 2021 Maryland marijuana adult use legislation bill, which will be introduced this session. And depending on the parameters associated with the process and COVID and the limitations, we have party leadership support. We have Senator Bill Ferguson in the Senate, Adrian Jones in the House, recognizing that it's time for the Maryland General Assembly to put an adult use bill through. And so I want folks to really quickly understand that at the federal level, this law passed, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. And 7 of Maryland's 8 congressional delegation voted in favor of it. It establishes community reinvestment grant programs, community opportunity grant fund, cannabis opportunity grant programs. This is sort of business development investments under the Small Business Administration and other restorative and work to reinvest in communities damaged by the war on drugs. Here in Maryland, we have over 15,000 arrests still under this theoretically legal decriminalized thing we have in Maryland. Still today, just for marijuana possession alone, we have over 15,000 arrests, okay? So our legislative priority is to end marijuana possession arrests in the state.
Thank you, Luke.
Am I out of time?
Yes.
Okay, well, let me just close then by saying that we do have legislation. We spoke with Senator Brian Feldman live this past week. He's going to be our bill sponsor in the Senate. If you didn't have a chance to watch that interview, go to marylandnormal.org, which will bring up our Facebook feed and you'll see the video there. And of course, coming up this coming Wednesday, you don't want to miss our interview with our bill sponsor in the House, Delegate Jazz Lewis. Thank you very much. I can't wait to get some questions. I'll stop sharing now.
All right, thank you. Next up, Willie Flowers of the NAACP.
Good afternoon. My name is Willie Flowers, president of the NAACP Maryland State Conference. The Maryland State Conference is a statewide connection of 24 branches, youth councils, and college chapters. From our smallest county unit to the largest university chapter, our advocacy to be on the front line of tackling the challenge of healing the many pitfalls and social determinants of health in Maryland is where our focus lies. As a volunteer organization, our committee structure is designed to both recruit leadership and inspire organizers to shepherd grassroots work to value citizens and guide empowerment at all levels with the aim of dismantling systemic racism when we find it. Whether we're talking about economic empowerment, entrepreneurship, employment, access to housing and home ownership, the technological divide, or education, all these systems have cracks in them and lead to failing health outcomes in our families and communities at a micro level and exposes a broken system at the macro or systems level. It stands to be noted at this time in the 21st century, Black African people in this country are being recorded in history for how we die and not how we live. And the state of Maryland is no exception. The details of such a statement play out in street corners, hospital rooms, and even in backseats of police cars in our state. It should also be noted that the narrative for the NAACP has never been just about identifying the problem, but organizing around solutions and to empower ourselves to heal broken systems at the grassroots level. To that end, our committee structure allows for a focus not just on these social determinants, and one of those being education, where we're picking up and collaborating with organizers of the HBCU Settlement Coalition, and also occurring. But over the summer, we had basically we're pulled into a situation with the School of the Deaf and working with Senator Guy Gazon to remedy a situation with the students there, and basically a history of discrimination. And also other universities have had these challenges with basically either racial or homophobic, xenophobic attacks. And one thing that came out of it was the consideration of a bill that would basically reimburse families and students when they're feel this anxiety, and some of them withdraw from school. As it stands, there's no support for them if they decide to withdraw from school. So we're looking for that and connecting with leaders who will guide that legislation. Under economic justice, in the last session, the Center for Urban Families approached, carried the bill over the line, but it wasn't totally restored. And basically the concept is to reduce the impact on incarcerated individuals when it comes down to child support. And this was spearheaded by Delegate Kathleen Dumas. And then we're following under housing, affirmingly furthering fair housing. This is a bill picked up by Delegate Brooke Learman, and we're looking at that very closely for support to carry it over the line. Basically restores or makes a state more intentional about supporting the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And under health, both Senator Antonio Hayes and Jazz Lewis, along with the Healthcare for All, are pushing the Health Equity Resource Community Resolution. This is something that brings back up the conversation about health enterprise zones that were passed several years ago, but it restores it and makes it stronger. And then we have a discussion about preemption and this whole reality about tobacco and impact of tobacco at the local level, but also flavored tobacco. And that's a bill by Senator Mary Washington, and the horrors of what it does to young people in the long term. and around environmental justice, the Climate Crisis and Education Act, our CCEA, something that's being pushed by Climate Exchange and their Rebuild Maryland Coalition. And we're supporting that act. And also, while someone mentioned Delegate Lori Jarkonian earlier, she attempted to pass a Community Choice Energy Act at the state level, and I think ran out of time. So she's trying the bill at the local level, and we're supporting that initiative. And then SEIU, Organized Labor, is pushing forth the Maryland Central Workers Protection Act, and the details of that are just restoring, supporting families and workers during this time of COVID-19. And under public safety, it's kind of public safety, but also juvenile justice. It's this issue of which was not mentioned earlier, but Delegate Nick Charles and Senator Jill Carter both have bills that's focused on this whole, this initial Caring Call Act that kind of sets the tone for these negative police incidents that we've heard about. And so they're working on that, and we're supporting those bills as they come forth. And then the Juvenile Restoration Act that was in the last session. It was House Bill 1437, and we're supporting the campaign for fair sentencing for youth. And also we've been working on juvenile justice and the reality that young people who are incarcerated in the juvenile justice system don't have the protections of other students, of other incarcerated people, because they are students. So the focus on them having all the resources, all the devices, all the social distancing have been something that we've been working on throughout the COVID quarantine season. And I'm ready for any questions that anyone has. So thank you for the presentation.
Unmute me. Okay, thank you, Willie. Before I turn the program over to Jessica Gorski, who will be doing the questions, I want to remind everyone that this afternoon at 2 o'clock, we have women's issues, consumer rights, and elections. The presenters will be Maryland Now, Maryland PIRG, Maryland Consumer Rights Coalition, AARP, League of Women Voters of Maryland, and the Reproductive Justice Inside. Jess, I need you to unmute and put your picture up. Okay, Jess.
Hi, everybody. I don't know, can everybody see me?
Need a little.
Oh, hi, yep, I had it, yep.
Now I can see you.
Now you're just looking at my ceiling, that's exciting. Yeah. You can tell I was just staring at my computer the entire chat there, so go ahead and get into questions. Before we get into questions, I just wanted to take a moment to say hello to Senator Wallstreicher, and we have a couple delegates joining us as well this morning. Delegate Eric Ebersole and Delegate Sheila Ruth, Jen Terrasa, Delegate Terry Hills, Delegate Ben Brooks. We have the Chief Councilwoman Liz Walsh from Howard County, and Aaron Mansour, Chief of Staff from Senator Lamb's office. So just welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And also thank you again to all of our presenters for taking the time to speak with us this morning. This is one of my favorite events. I love hearing all the priority legislation. I am a legislation geek, and I absolutely love hearing everything that's going to be championed during the upcoming session. So that being said, people keep asking, will we be able to get copies of these priority legislations, and will we have the links? Keep checking your chat box. There's a PDF packet that's being shared. All of the organizations have shared their priority legislation with us. And we will be passing out 4 packets, one for each presentation panel. We're passing out the one for this morning right now, but we'll also be passing out one that contains all of it. So if you have any questions, you can pull up any of the legislation there in case you missed something.
Yes,
so
just
yes.
Regina Boyce joined us. Delegate Regina Boyce.
Oh, Regina Boyce, wonderful, welcome. And so our first question goes to CASA this morning, if Catherine Paul is still with us. We have a question just asking, who decides how much money each jurisdiction receives from ICE? Is Ms. Paul still with us?
I'm still with us. I see she's gone.
Okay, I can go ahead and oh, she needs to be unmuted.
Unmute
Please.
her. Unmute.
Okay, great. Ms.
Oh.
Catherine Paul. Great. Do we unmute her?
Might go on in a second and then they can go back.
Okay, great. So our next, we'll go back to Ms. Paul in one moment then. Our next question for Free State Justice. So will you address the president's EO where healthcare providers can refuse to provide healthcare based on religious and conscientious belief? And that would go to Jeremy Lemaster. So can you answer that question, please?
Great. Yes, I can. So we actually, what isn't presented here today, we do have kind of an extra bucket around healthcare policy that isn't focused in today's session. However, what I will say is there are a number of ongoing issues in the state of Maryland, especially in accessing, just access to healthcare, issues around medical debt and non-discrimination sort of language for insurance for trans-affirming therapies and surgeries. And so I don't necessarily want to speak too much on that here now. And we're still trying to kind of finalize the list of the healthcare related policy priorities that will be in this upcoming session. But I do know that we have a group of our board's policy committee that is kind of looking into this and trying to make sure we're moving some things forward. Unfortunately, with COVID and a lot of other factors, we're trying to really kind of carry forward a lot of what was introduced last session and kind of get those over the hill and then kind of build up casework to better enhance protections in healthcare access, especially around requirements for cultural competency training for healthcare providers in the state of Maryland, as well as sort of better pathways for making complaints and getting resources or support when LGBTQ folks' healthcare needs are not met. And so that is something we're in the works for, but might have to be something that's in a future legislative session.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for answering that. Then we'll go back to Catherine. I see that she answered here that each contract is different in referencing who gets the money from ICE for each jurisdiction. And she said that she's going to post that. Catherine, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sorry, Jess. For some reason, I could not unmute myself. Yeah, so each contract is different. So different counties make different amounts of money, right? And they also detain a different, different ranges of how many beds they actually rent to ICE, right? And so each one is different, but the bill not only does that, but it also keeps private immigration independent detention centers from coming into Maryland, right? And so even if there wasn't a contract with the county and ICE just wanted to set up their own individual ICE detention center, right, which they would still be profiting off of immigrants through contracts with different correctional, different types of correctional businesses, that bill would take care of that as well. So I'm gonna pull up some data and drop it in the chat in just a few minutes. You can see how much money counties have profited off of immigrant detention in the recent years.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our next question is going to go to MLaw, Michael Cohen. Michael, could you let us know if MLaw will support overriding the governor's veto of the bill to establish the women's pre-release centers?
I expect that we would, because it was on our agenda last year, but it was not presented at the conference. So there was no report on that. But so we have not taken a position at this point.
Okay.
you know, we haven't been asked yet, but.
Yes,
Okay.
sorry to interrupt you, but we also want to welcome the Montgomery County Board of Education President Brenda Wolf.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to move on to our next questions for Luke Jones. I have 2 questions for you. One, they asked if there were specific bills that Normal supports, and I believe that that is in the PDF documents that you sent to us that we are going to share with everyone. But the other question was, can you restate what you said about we advocate for the rational application of law? And it was spot on, like much of you said, much of what you said. The asker is Renee. She'd like you to repeat the statement. We advocate for the rational application of law.
Yes.
And she wanted you to restate that.
Handoff, and I'll just briefly start with that, is that what I was saying is that we don't advocate for consumption of marijuana, or advocate unhealthy or unsafe behavior. What we advocate for is rational public policy.
Okay.
Okay. And so, what are our goals here? Our goals should be to, support people and help people on board to, healthy, self-fulfilling future, a life, and support people and not, put balls and chains around people's ankles and expect for them to thrive and contribute and reach their full potential. So it doesn't help at all to involve the police, and the involvement of the police was a racist policy decision to start with, and it had the desired effect. So we will have legislation this coming session sponsored in the House by Delegate Jazz Lewis from Prince George's County, District 24. He will be our guest on Wednesday night on our Facebook Live weekly show, and he will be describing the provisions of his bill, which was pre-filed, has a legislative services number assigned to it. As we know, we're waiting for the legislative services to produce the text of the pre-filed bills. We are working very closely with Senator Brian Feldman in the Senate, who will be the bill sponsor in the Senate. He has not filed his bill yet. He's working with Delegate Jazz Lewis and other members of the Assembly to make any modifications to the final text that are needed to produce a 3/5 majority support in both houses, both chambers, to survive a veto. So we have majority votes, but there are certain interests that need to make sure their interests are represented in this legislation before we can get the full support of the Legislative Black Caucus and the full support of the necessary veto-proof consensus. So,
Thank you, Luke.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. We will make sure that we're sharing all these documents and all of the presentations at the end. I have a couple more questions. Mr. Willie Flowers from the NAACP. Is the HBCU override at NAACP priority this year?
Yes, it is. I thought I brought that up in my statements, but yes, it is.
And on a police accountability and reform sexual, I'm not sure if this goes to you or to the ACLU, but it asks on police accountability and reform, the sexual assault should be treated as
ACLU has
first
left.
felony, not a misdemeanor. A misdemeanor is not preventative. How do we increase the penalty? What'd you say? Sorry. Ed?
ACLU is not here.
Oh, I have.
I'm still here.
Oh, you are
Okay.
here. Okay.
Okay.
So I don't know if Mr. Flowers wants to answer that question. I mean, real simply, I mean, just like, any other legislative change, it's through the legislative advocacy process. I think, it's a challenging question, and a lot of people have competing views.
But I'm still not seeing him down here on my right screen here.
And I have another question for you as well while I have you on here, and it was listed for
first because he just spoke.
Ed, you need to mute yourself, please. Thanks. So how of the, does the removal of SRO initiative include training criteria for the security guards? Their training and higher criterion will be critical to our schools. So that was a question about, out of your 5 initiatives listed, will that be included?
Yes, that's definitely an important point. We certainly agree about that. And the bill will have new training requirements for school security, additional reporting requirements of how students are interacting with security guards during these incidents, and also better training with regard to when and how security guards should make those determinations about whether to involve law enforcement in emergency situations. But yeah, that's definitely a key component as well.
Wonderful. And I have another question for you. And this, I'm not sure if this, this was listed both with the NAACP and ACLU. Have the 5 police bills been profiled yet? Can you tell us who's sponsoring? That's for the ACLU. But the other question for either of you gentlemen are police applicants asked if they are or have been members of a hate group, or if they've ever participated in a hate group event live, social media? Is there a list of these hate groups just in general? And Maryland state county government applicants or employees ask these questions. So those are 2 questions right there, and I can separate them out if you wish.
Sorry, the first question was just whether they've been pre-filed.
It was just asking if the 5 police bills have been filed yet, and if we had sponsors already for those.
Yeah, so as of now, repealing the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, the Use of Force Bill, and the MPIA Reform Bill have all been pre-filed. The sponsors are for LIBOR are Gabe Acevedo in the House and Senator Jill Carter. For Use of Force, it's Deborah Davis in the House and Jill Carter again in the Senate. For PIA, it's again Gabe Acevedo and Jill Carter. SROs and local control, we're still finalizing sponsors. So for SROs on the House, there are actually technically 2 SRO bills that are being filed by Delegate Acevedo and Delegate Janelle Wilkins. We're still looking for a Senate sponsor. And then on local control, we have the Senate sponsor, Senator Jill Carter, and really just waiting to see what the speakers, what bills she's going to be supporting, and that'll determine who we get to sponsor the bill on the House side.
Okay, thank you for that. And then the second part of that, it was sent over as from one person, but it had important questions in it. Are police applicants asked, and our state or county government applicants or employees asked about their affiliation, whether it is in person or via social media, with hate groups? And is there a registered list of hate groups for this area?
Well, I think there are certainly different registered lists through different organizations. I'm not aware of whether those questions are asked in interviews and the job application process. I mean, it certainly touches on an important issue. There's lots of evidence that shows that members of hate groups, white nationalists, white supremacists are, certainly entering into police forces, not just in Maryland, but across the state, serving in the military. So it's definitely like a very important issue that we need to have a better response to. But I'm not aware that that's, or how that's dealt with through the job application process.
Yeah, I think that's a no. And the Southern Poverty Law Center kind of and the FBI keep a very detailed list of hate groups. So if that type of thing is important.
Okay, so, and I'm familiar that, it seems to take more effort than is necessary to list someone as a hate group. Not every group that is involved with posting things. Do you know the criteria we passed a law, some of the laws recently with the noose and persons and groups. Do you think it's easier to kind of identify people's affiliations with that now before they're hired or no?
I don't
No.
think that you can identify anybody's affiliation until you catch them in the act.
Right.
That's the problem with I guess, racism.
Thank you. And also for you, Willie Flowers, who should be, is the NAACP actively supporting the blueprint for Maryland Education Transformational
Yes.
bill will need to override?
Yes, I guess consistent with what I said in the presentation, we're supporting the HBCU settlement and the blueprint. Those are priorities in the last session, and we'll work for them until they're passed.
All right, thank you. The other next question I have is, is for, it's a general question to the panel, and they've asked a lot of questions actually about the Howard County Detention Center. They seem to have a focus on there, and I'm not sure who can answer questions, exactly pertaining to that facility, but possibly people have an answer in general. It's just asking who's investigating human rights violations, maybe at Howard County Detention Center or local detention centers. Maybe CASA would have this answer. And monitoring like COVID cases and, people that are still being in there because because Howard County currently still has an ICE contract there.
Right.
Sorry, there's several questions pertaining to this. I'm trying to combine them, not eloquently apparently, but the questions pertain to the ICE contract and how people would get involved in following up with what's going on. Would CASA have that answer or anyone else? No.
I'm not sure if CASA is still on, but
okay.
I can just speak like really briefly that certainly over the summer, shortly after the pandemic began, there were a lot of efforts specifically targeting the Howard County Detention Center. So we were involved in a few lobbying efforts, particularly at the federal level, to get our Maryland senators to pressure ICE in order to get more oversight over conditions in the Howard County Detention Center.
Okay, thank you. And our very last question is a general ask as well. Is anyone willing to sponsor legislation focused on community review board for each police agency? On voting justice, you can support a universal voting bill of rights that guarantees a safe, unfettered, equitable voting opportunity for all 18 and over. I'm not sure if that goes with it, but is anyone sponsoring legislation focused on community review board for all of the police agencies? And I've heard some of that. No?
We've been looking at it, but there's nothing afoot now.
Okay. All right.
I would just chime in really quickly to say that our bill to repeal the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, when it's actually completed, the drafting, will allow local jurisdictions to, if they choose to do so, to start having those conversations about independent review boards.
Okay. And is there any merit to some of the discussion that's being heard from the Senate about having an overreaching set of standards for all police agencies rather than having them interpret them themselves, so that there's a set of standards across all boards for Maryland that they have to meet? Have you heard more about that from the ACLU or NAACP?
Could you repeat the question, please?
There was some discussion that with the law enforcement, Bill of Rights, that there would be some action towards setting a standard across all police agencies, let's say 132 different police agencies, rather than setting out guidelines that they have to meet according to their interpretation, rather having everybody meet the same set of standards, the same guidelines across the board, and kind of setting that from Maryland state legislation. And that was something that was being discussed in some possible policy legislation policy discussions earlier this fall, and I was wondering if there was any traction with any of that, with any of the legislation that any of you are working on.
If I'm understanding the question correctly, yeah, I mean, that's what our bill to repeal the law enforcement officers would do, set out the default process that all agencies would be, required to go through, but it would still allow some local decision-making, to provide the possibility for more independent disciplinary processes as well.
Okay, so it's about 3/4 of what was originally discussed, but still allows for some individual interpretation on local level. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I believe that's all the questions, and I will turn it back over to Ed, and we appreciate everybody taking the time to answer these questions.
Uh-oh. It's there, it's back there. Anyway, we haven't had too many technical difficulties today, but anyway. And we look forward to seeing you all this afternoon. So have a good afternoon. Have a good lunch, and we'll see you then.
What time?
2 o'clock.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you, Ed.
And the information is in the chat. We won't close out yet, so we don't lose the chat. Hit save the chat now and mute me.